All right, good evening, everybody. This is Mark Malloy with Emerging Revolutionary War. And tonight we're joined by a very special guest, historian and archaeologist Damian Shiels, who is actually coming to us live tonight from Ireland. And I think this is very cool. This is our first international revelry for the Emerging Revolutionary War show here. And we're very happy. This is, this past week, we just celebrated St. Patrick's Day, and March here in America is Irish American Heritage Month. So I got my Guinness here and ready to sit down and talk about the Irish Rebellion of 1798, the Battle of Vinegar Hill. And this is really exciting for us because there's a lot of international components of the American Revolution when it breaks out, and it's gonna spread like wildfire all across the globe. Most famously with the French Revolution, it's gonna break out in the 1780s. But there are numerous rebellions that pop up in revolutions all across the globe. And myself, having Irish ancestry and having been able to had the opportunity to visit Ireland a few times. It was the rebellion that broke out in Ireland in 1798 that's always kind of captured my imagination. I always thought it was fascinating to see the movement that ultimately led to this ultimately a very bloody conflict in the summer of 1798. And there's a recent book that just came out about Vinegar Hill and the Wexford rebels in 1798, and I saw there was one of the contributors there was Damian, and I've seen him do things with our sister site at Emerging Civil War, and I know he has a lot of experience doing all sorts of things on both sides of Ireland and in America. So I thought it was a great opportunity to invite him on here. Talk a little bit about the rebellion, and then specifically talk about some of the work he's been able to do as an archaeologist as it relates to some of these battles that happened during that rebellion. So welcome, Damian. If you want to give a little background on who you are and why you're here tonight, that'd be great.
Yeah, cheers, Mark. Thanks a million for the invite. It's great to be on, and nice to hear as well when we were having our little pre-chat that you have good Limerick roots as well as one of the areas in Ireland to have as a Limerick man myself. It's good to hear. But yeah, it's nice to be on. It's actually the first time in a long time I've been talking to an American audience about the other side of what I do, because mainly it usually is about the American Civil War. So yeah, I kind of wear two hats. So that my history hat is Irish America oriented and American Civil War oriented. And I suppose the kind of main output I do with that is with colleagues of mine, Dr. Catherine Bates and Brendan Hamilton. We have a site, IrishAmericanCivilWar.com, where we've been running now since 2010. That was where it all went wrong for me with the American Civil War, took over my existence. But yeah, so I've been working on the American Civil War for a long time and going back and forth and doing that. But my kind of long time, I work full-time as a historian at the moment, but my long-time career has been as an archaeologist and a conflict archaeologist and battlefield archaeologist in Ireland, and working on all periods from different conflicts, a lot of 16th and 17th century engagements, a lot of stuff recently about our own War of Independence. Actually, I should take this opportunity to give a plug if anyone is really keen to hear more about the archaeology of the Irish War of Independence. We have a free all-day online conference next Saturday that you can attend. I can give you the details of that. But yeah, so an awful lot of opportunities to try and explore some of these sites, but the biggest one that was ever conducted in Ireland was this Vinegar Hill survey that we did, which produced really remarkable results. I suppose I should just say, like, we have a bit of a different relationship with our battlefields in Ireland here. So say where you might be used to seeing incredibly well preserved sites like Gettysburg, for example, Ireland doesn't preserve its battlefields. So, in fact, there's only one small portion of a battlefield called the Boyne, which has a bit of state ownership to it. So most of the rest of them are just ordinary sites, ordinary fields that don't, in many cases, attract an awful lot of attention. Vinegar Hill does, though, but we'll get into that, I'm sure. But
are most of them privately owned, or?
Yeah, so a lot of them would have been built over. A lot of them are farmland. So a lot of the genesis of, say, the work that we did, and we'll maybe have a look at a couple of things later, but we're part of an effort by the state to try and determine where our battlefields are, what's left of them, and what might be there from a kind of a preservation perspective. And it's a project. I ran the archaeological side of it, and colleagues in Enniskillen ran the historical side of that. We were effectively looking for every battlefield in Ireland between the 8th and 18th century. So that was when I first started looking for Vinegar Hill in close detail and the battles in 1798. So it was a pretty big remit. So
yeah.
Well, it was 15 years ago, and we're about to publish the 1798 volume, hopefully in the not too distant future. So
really? I mean, I just think it's amazing, and we often talk about that here in the United States is, places like Manassas are unique in that there are two battlefields on the same location. But when you're talking about centuries of conflict, like you're talking about, there's got to be numerous layers at numerous places, I'd imagine. So
precisely, and as you know yourself, Mark, like Ireland is a small island. It's kind of compact, It's so there's a lot of this kind of material everywhere, but it is actually among our most vulnerable because it's often been, it's easy to protect the big castle if it's sitting in the middle of a field because you can see it. A lot of this, the problem that we've had with the battlefield stuff is that you can't really see it. It's as opposed to the untrained eye, they just look like fields. That was one of the interesting things about things like this project looking at 1798 is we saw the degree to which the fields that you're looking at and everything in the fields was actually a major part of the engagements in 1798. The landscape that's there has survived pretty well in most cases. So yeah, it was nice to kind of shed a light on it. And Wexford County Council, who funded the local authority, who funded the work down at Vinegar Hill, have done an incredible job in kind of showcasing what's possible with the book that you were just showing everyone there. Because that was a major project that didn't just look at archaeology, it's folklore, it's history, it's a whole load of different things.
Yeah, no. And yeah, going down to Enniscorthy, they have a great little museum down there too.
Yeah.
1798 Rebellion Center. That interprets some of this history.
It's super, yeah, super.
Yeah, no, but let's tell us a little bit about 1798 Ireland. So obviously there's conflict between the Irish and the English going back hundreds and hundreds of years. Where does 1798 fit into the timeline of Irish history here? Yeah,
well, I suppose to kind of give it a bit of a background and to tie it to America as well. I mean, sometimes we can think of places as if they're very isolated in this period, but really it's a very international context in the 18th century. And it often gets left out of, say, the revolutionary story. But for example, Ireland was a major if you like, staging post for the British in relation to the American Revolution. So I'm looking out, if it wasn't dark, I would be looking out at Cork Harbour, which is where the fleet left every year to resupply New York during the Revolution. This was like the main base for resupplying of those troops. And you can almost take it back. So the American Revolution breaks out and people in Europe are looking at this, as we know, and kind of going, oh, I wouldn't mind a bit of that myself. And you see in Ireland, which is used for a long period of time as a base for British troops. So a significant number of British troops are moved out of Ireland to North America, right, to fight. And you see a kind of a building up of a group called the Irish Volunteers, like kind of a local force at this period to try and take over some of the military function in the state, and some elements of that start to get a bit radicalized by what's going on in America. The government, I suppose, at the time, you would have to say, there's a period where what's called the penal laws are enforced. So there isn't complete freedom of worship for Catholics. It had been easing through this period of the 18th century, but those in power were Protestants, so the Protestant ascendancy. So you have a disaffected Catholic class. But as people begin to look at America, and then particularly the French Revolution, which itself, of course, is inspired, when the French Revolution breaks out in 1789, there's an awful lot of people, if you like, in the kind of middle and upper classes, looking at what's going on and beginning to kind of think about Republican ideals. And then in 1791, a group of these people form a society called the United Irishmen Society. And what was very special about it was that it wasn't broken down along religious lines particularly. The earliest members were Presbyterians. So you have a lot of what would be called Ulster Scots, who of course played an enormous role themselves in the Revolution, are involved in this society. You have a lot of Protestants involved in it as well. And then you have Catholics too. So you have some of the similar issues so there's alternate taxation. This is something I'm sure that I believe it was a bit of a problem in America as well for some people, things like tax. So everyone kind of is beginning to look, well, in this society towards the ideals of republicanism. And that society gains a lot of traction among different levels of society. It sets itself up in a very kind of localized way. So it's a national society, but as the 1790s progress and the British War with revolutionary France comes to the fore in the 1790s, it's driven underground, this organization. So originally a kind of a debating site, it's driven underground and it becomes increasingly militarized as the 1790s continue. It founds itself on, local towns would have their own little section, and then if they would report to the people in the county, which is the equivalent of a state, and so on up the chain. So it was designed to be this kind of regional force that could rise. And things came to a head in 1796, first of all, when it was persuaded, the French were persuaded to launch an invasion of Ireland. And they actually sent 15,000 troops to Ireland, who got all the way into a place called Bantry Bay down in West Cork, but the wind and the weather prevented them from landing. They were literally just offshore, 15,000 odd men. Some of them had been blown off course, but most of them were there. And they had to return to France. They left behind, quite famously, an admiral's launch, or a small launch from one of their boats, which is still preserved in the National Museum of Ireland and is supposed to be the oldest French naval vessel in the world surviving, because the rest of the French Navy has issues at places like Trafalgar. But so this really, 1796 and the almost French landing really sets everything off. And so there's a real effort to try and de-arm the population and to fully suppress the United Irishmen. And then eventually in 1798, in May of 1798, the Rising starts. So that's the kind of background to where it led. And there's a whole load of interesting sidelines. One of the leaders of the United Irishmen was a guy called Wolfe Tone, who had to flee Ireland in the early 1790s. And he goes to America. That's where he goes. And I have to be honest, he didn't like America very much. You would think because he shared a lot of the same ideals, he would love it. I think he was in Philadelphia he was spending time with. But his major concern, it seems, during his entire time in exile in America was that his daughter would someday end up marrying an American. He was terrified of this prospect. So even though they shared a lot of the ideals, he doesn't seem to have had much time for America. He was much more into France. But so you see these links back and forth, the influences from even the war actually being underway in America, back and forth as to how it builds towards what happens in 1798.
Yeah, no, and I mean, you mentioned Wolfe Tone. I think he's just an interesting character, and I've read some of his autobiography where he talks about being over in Philadelphia. I think he meets George Washington while he's there too. Just kind of meeting two minds, and I think he called Washington a high flying aristocrat or something.
Yeah, he really didn't like it. He really did not like it. And his wife, who was actually ends up there herself for decades in the 19th century, doesn't like it either. She's always giving out about it. She thinks they'd be a bit more grateful, but anyway, it worked. Yeah. So,
but it's in the tying to the French Revolution is also really interesting because obviously, yeah, France being a major Catholic monarchy they're living under, and just this whole time period, I think a lot of people are surprised by the the United Irishmen. Not, I think it's typically viewed as Catholics versus Protestant, and there's obviously a very long history of that in Ireland, but this was an attempt to break that mold and unite against Great Britain, which was revolutionary in itself at that time.
Absolutely. It was a real moment, and you would wonder, had it been successful, what might have been in terms of the subsequent history of the island. But it was certainly a kind of a key point in time, and Ireland had looking to France. I mean, the Irish rebels, if you like, had a long tradition of looking to the continent for whoever was deemed to be Britain's number one enemy. For example, in the 16th and 17th century, it was to Spain that Ireland traditionally turned. But in the 18th century, it was France. Consistently France through the Jacobite period and on through the 7 Years' War and everything and all that. So it's very interesting. And it kind of continues, like, not to get I promise I won't talk about the American Civil War after this, but Thomas Francis Meagher, who founds the Irish Brigade, he goes to France. He's a rebel leader in 1848. They look back at 1798. He goes to France and he brings back a flag based on the French model, which is today the Irish national flag. So that kind of link is amazing,
No, like you said, when Great Britain's in trouble, right? That's the opportunity for Ireland, and obviously, the France helped America secure our independence during our revolution. Of course, that was the monarchy at that time, but it's amazing too. When you realize that the Navy doesn't have to go across the whole ocean to go in and be right in Ireland, they'd be able to support that. And I feel like that's also what Wolfe Tone spends most of his time during this rebellion, trying to get that foreign aid.
That's right. And is himself captured very late in the rebellion off the coast of Donegal, trying to bring more French troops in. Something that ultimately leads to his death. This kind of, and I mean, you will see it from an archaeological perspective around Ireland, is the fear, and there is a constant fear that Ireland can be used as a backdoor by enemies of Britain to invade. And that is what the Spanish tried to do, and it's what the French attempt to do as well. And so you see during these invasion scares, particularly in the 1790s, and again, it happens again with Napoleon Bonaparte in the early 19th century, there's a big building phase of fortifications. So like Cork Harbour, where I am here now, first gets properly fortified during the American Revolution because of the fear of French and American ships potentially attacking bases here. And that sort of fortification just ramps up as the ongoing conflict with France that kind of continues all through on and off during the Revolutionary and the Napoleonic Wars. These gun towers are built, Martello towers, all around the coast. Signal towers are built all around the coast to try and alert of a French invasion. So it's this kind of years and years of a threat. We can look back now and go, well, it didn't happen, but to the extent that they were worried, but they were very worried that it was going to happen. And you can see that everywhere around the island today.
And just as a historian of the American War of Independence, you quickly realize that, when France gets involved in our war, the entire British strategy changes, because that is their true fear of is a major world power like that. And you can see it, and I use, these rebellions of these other places, as soon as France gets involved, things start to get serious.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the potential to really impact on their home waters is a massive threat to them. It completely influences the response.
And so, before we talked, you were showing me some images. Maybe you want to show us some of the the connections. You're showing me some of the connections of the Revolutionary War.
Yeah, I'll hopefully this
Yeah.
works now like it did. You can see that, yeah? Yeah. So if I can get it to flick forward. So I'll flip on to some of the links. So the 1798 rebellion is a really important one for anyone who's interested, I think, in the American Revolutionary War and then interested in the subsequent Napoleonic Wars. It doesn't get much of a it doesn't get, I think, what it deserves to get, particularly from the viewpoint of its use for the development of British tactics that are used later, say, in the Peninsula and fighting Napoleon and stuff. So you have this kind of interesting mix in 1798 of British officers who had fought in the Revolution, and then these kind of the younger ones are coming through who are going to go on to become quite famous fighting Napoleon's France. But like just some of and these are specifically looking at generals who are engaged in Vinegar Hill, in the move towards Vinegar Hill and that kind of crescendo of the rebellion in Wexford, which we'll talk about in a moment maybe. But like these guys had all been in the American Revolution, most of them. Gerard Lake, who is the overall command at Vinegar Hill, is in North Carolina in Yorktown. Francis Needham is at Yorktown. Henry Johnson, who fights outside in Escorty, is all over the place as well. Loftus is in different locations. He apparently, according to one account, whether it's apocryphal or not, had an opportunity at one occasion to capture George Washington, but didn't.
Wow.
General John Moore, who becomes exceptionally famous afterwards, also served as an officer in the Revolution in the 82nd Regiment of Foot. He's generally seen as the father of light infantry tactics, and he dies in the retreat from Corunna fighting the French. But of course, I don't know if anyone has heard of this guy Cornwallis, but he was apparently involved in the American Revolution in some degree. But when the 1798 rebellion breaks out, he is Lord Lieutenant and Commander-in-Chief in Ireland. But there's an interesting connection on the other side as well, because one of the leading United Irishmen is a guy called Lord Edward Fitzgerald, and he had also fought in the Revolution, and he is influenced by what he experiences in America. He was aide-de-camp to Lord Rawdon. He was really badly wounded in the Carolinas in 1781. And he was carried off the field. This is a fascinating story. He was carried off the field by an escaped African-American, formerly enslaved man. And then he brought him back to Ireland with him, and he lived with him. They were close friends for many years afterwards. Tony Small was his name. He lived with the family for quite a length of time. And Lord Edward Fitzgerald, as the rebellion is just breaking out, the rebellion is launched because there is British intelligence that it's about to happen in Dublin, and they move to arrest a lot of their leaders. Lord Edward Fitzgerald is mortally wounded while he's being arrested. So he's one of the kind of big names to lose their life. But this is a painting that he had commissioned of Tony Small. So you can see the links, these amazing links back and forth through that conflict, through what was going on in America. It's the same personalities who were involved in it.
No, that's an amazing story, and tied to the actual battlefields of the Revolutionary War here in America. And I think Lord Edward Fitzgerald is a perfect example of showing the really how diverse the United Irishmen were, in the sense that you have such a famous person taking on the cause of the United Irishmen. And you're right, early on, it's almost like, I think all the leaders are basically sold out early on, and all captured or
precisely. It's probably a good time. I'll go back to this map, but in terms of how it develops, and I'll be brief here but So as I was mentioning, the way it was structured was so it's quite local units that are designed to effectively then spread around the country. So they get word and they rise, and then the people in the next town rise, and the people in the next town rise. And so the whole plan for the 1798 rebellion was that Dublin would be the centre of it. And the intention was that Dublin would start the rising. The mail coaches were to be intercepted, and that was the out of Dublin, and that was to be the signal for the entire country to rise, the United Irishmen across the country. But it is, if you like, abortive in its early stages because of the knowledge that the administration get of the Dublin rising. And so they're able to immediately suppress that before it even really starts. They arrest a lot of the leaders. And so people are confused as to whether the rising is happening or it isn't happening. Initially, in late May of 1798, the counties around Dublin, so Kildare and Meath, they rise. And so there are battles fought in those counties. And it's worth pointing out at this stage that most of the fighting is Irish versus Irish. We have a tendency, particularly in Ireland, we always go, well, there's the Irish and then there's the British side. But most of the British side in this are Irish militia as well, right? So there's a number of Scots units as well that have been brought in, fencible units, etc. And there are some British regulars who come in as war extends. But because the rising spreads to Kildare and Meath, but it's quickly crushed there. There's a battle, for example, at the famous Hill of Tara, which is a very famous site in Ireland. And it moves up. The Presbyterians rise in Antrim and down in the northeast of Ireland. But again, they fight a number of battles there, but it's put down. So it's kind of happening sporadically around the country. But the area that really is the most significant of all is County Wexford. That place just down in the southeast, you can see on this map. Wexford rises in late May, and South Wicklow as well. And they have an extraordinary success quite quickly. They very soon, in a number of key battles, push government troops out of that county, that area of South Wexford. So it becomes the Wexford Republic as it's known. Really, really successful. But because everywhere else it's not working, eventually the government is able to surround the county. The Wexford United Irishmen fought a couple of battles, one of which we'll talk about in a second, at New Ross, another at Arklow, to try and spread the battle outside of the county, but they are defeated. And eventually the administration sends different columns of government troops under the generals we were just looking at there into different parts of Wexford. And they move in to Vinegar Hill, which is their main encampment. And that's why that then is the decisive battle of the 1798 rebellion, which ends in government victory. But it kind of staggers on the rebellion. There's a couple of battles fought as guys, if you like, try and get away from Wexford. The French arrive again, but they come in August. The rebellion has been crushed, if you like, in June 1798. And the French land over on the west coast of Ireland with 1,000 men in August. And have a couple of they're joined by a few thousand locals. They have a couple of initial successful engagements, but are eventually themselves defeated and surrender. More troops come in then after that, coming in. That's where Wolfe Tone gets captured up off the coast, northwest coast of Donegal. So it's all a bit sporadic and spread out, and it just allowed the administration to move around and defeat it in detail, if you like. But Wexford for 1 month was the absolute seat of it all. And it saw incredible carnage during that time. Thousands of people lost their lives there. It was a bitter conflict. And it had a significant aftermath. It has an international aftermath. Before we go into the archaeological side of things, I'll just move on to that. So its legacy continues, and it's interesting to consider how it impacts once again its connections with America. So significant numbers of United Irishmen, some of them end up, for example, being sold into Prussian military service, and Napoleon manages to pick them up and they end up serving with Napoleon. Others are sent to Australia. The image on the right of this here is a battle outside Sydney in Australia in 1804, which is largely United Irishmen. Many of them were United Irishmen who fought there. It's actually often called the Battle of Vinegar Hill. As many of you will know, there are areas all over the United States that are called Vinegar Hill, and they are all named after the Battle of Vinegar Hill. They tended to be Irish communities. This image on the left is one I just took a few months ago on the Brooklyn Bridge. So the Vinegar Hill area of Brooklyn is commemorated on that. And that's so the Irish diaspora and the people Irish in Ireland immediately started to look at Vinegar Hill as this major event, and it becomes this kind of flag that they wave all the way through until eventual independence in the early 20th century. And they have a big impact on the War of 1812, which I know you've discussed on here before. Alan Taylor's book, which is great on it, he even has Irish rebels in the subtitle of his Civil War of 1812, because there are so many Irish ex-United Irishmen involved in that conflict. So it has that really interesting dynamic, both before and after.
No, I think, something that stood out to me, when you talk about this whole rebellion also being in many ways a civil war, is something that we always run into in the American Revolution. In very much a similar way, that a lot of people don't realize how much of this was brother versus brother. You also talk about, just the massive amount of death that occurs during this rebellion. It's pretty bloody, and I think that's usually what happens when there's a war, and numerous atrocities and all sorts of just awful things that happen throughout the rebellion. And you talk about the legacy of this too. As a purveyor of listening to lots of Irish music, references to 98 and Vinegar Hill are constant throughout that.
Completely, yeah. It's so significant as that route. If you look at any of the Irish rebellions afterwards, the 1848 rebellion, which is a major impact, if you like, on Irish in the Civil War in terms of a number of leaders who go out, 1867 Rising, 1916, and they're all looking back. So even actually in the Civil War, again, I know I promised, this is terrible. I've completely broken my promise about the Civil War. But some of when Irish are mobilizing in the Civil War in certain places, they are referencing 1798 as well, talking about it. So, and seeing the equivalency. So it's very, very significant in terms of its memory for Irish nationalism.
Yes, and I gotta say, when I went to the 1798 center there in Enniscorthy, the thing that struck me the most was I think near the end of the exhibits, there's a list of leaders of the 1798 rebellion and what happened to them, and it is executed, exiled, executed, exiled, and through the whole list of them. It was not only was it brutally put down, but those who are exiled, like you mentioned here, Australia, here in America. I many of these people who took part in this, they may leave, but then they're probably going to maintain that memory of what they just took part in. And then also just the sheer brutality of stomping out rebellion. Great Britain doesn't mess around with that, and it often makes me think about what would have happened to many of the American Revolution leaders had many of them been captured or suppressed.
It's one of the things it's worth noting about Wexford. So there are atrocities committed on both sides, and there is a bit of a legacy of it in an Irish context. Normally, and like as we pointed out earlier, there was Protestants, Presbyterians, and Catholics all together in this. But I think it would be wrong to say that there wasn't some sort of religious dynamic as well. And religious wars in Ireland have been going on for quite a long time, and religious wars tend to be particularly bloody. It kind of goes down to how loyalists were treated. So they tend to be referred to as loyalists in Wexford, but the loyalists did tend to be Protestant in Wexford. Although many of the leaders in Wexford were Protestant as well. But so there was a massacre after. We'll be touching on the Battle of New Ross, a massacre of a number of Protestants where they were burnt to death in a barn, loyalist Protestants, called Sculla Bogue, which became very notorious when United Irishmen heard that government troops were burning hospitals with United Irishmen in them in the town of New Ross. One of them set fire to the house and killed them. In Wexford, which was taken early by the United Irishmen in Wexford town, they began to execute some people at Wexford Bridge, but then when it was taken back, a lot of the leaders and other United Irishmen were executed at Wexford Bridge, so hanged off the side of it. So there's this kind of recrimination and counter strike that's going on all the time, that kind of leaves a particularly nasty taste in the mouth, I think, for anyone who must have been involved in that level. It was, for those who were just caught up in it, as is often the case with these sort of conflicts, if you had no skin in the game for either side, it was unbelievably dangerous to be wandering around a county like Wexford in the summer of that year, because anything could happen to you. There are notorious government efforts at repression, things like pitch capping guys where they put tar on their heads and things like this that were going on as well. So really, really brutal stuff.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about Vinegar Hill and some of the work you all done down there.
Yeah. So there's a couple of sites. I mean, I'm gonna fly through some slides, but a lot of there's two sites I want to talk to you about in relation to the archaeology of it. But I'll kind of just skip over, I think, the kind of a lot of the kind of background stuff on different types of conflict archaeology that have been done. But so as an archaeologist, I mean, the thing we're trying to do is identify traces on the ground. And we did this Irish Battlefields project that I was referring to earlier on, that was commissioned by the Irish government to try and identify Irish battles. And that was kind of the first time we looked at 1798. I was working with a company called Headland Archaeology and historians called Enniclan. So we were trying to identify the extent of these battles, what might be left and everything. And of course, we know they're far more than just the areas of engagement. There are all sorts of elements of them that we were looking at, like approach routes, retreat routes. So the image you see here on the right is where in 1798, John Moore, who again becomes famous later, he marches down this avenue before fighting the Battle of Fuchs Mills, where he had green-jacketed riflemen of the 60th Royal American Rifles, who are nearly all Germans, but are seen as there's always German/Hessians and stuff as well in all these conflicts at this period. So we were looking to see how they changed. This is kind of the brief that we were looking in these. Like, is it a completely different landscape now? Has it been built up? Has land been drained? Has a boggy area that might have been a key element of an engagement disappeared? And the way we did it is by looking at primary accounts and walking the ground and trying to familiarize ourselves a bit with the way the military operated then, and trying to find information in primary accounts. And this has been done on many American Revolutionary battlefields with enormous success. But looking at primary accounts and where they might say we marched to this hill, or we marched here, or we marched there. And I want to just talk about, as a prelude, how sometimes an awful small amount of archaeological information can tell you an awful lot. So before Vinegar Hill started, there was this battle at New Ross. So New Ross is a large town in County Wexford, and this is the early, if you like, thus far victorious United Irishmen attempting to push through and out of the county at New Ross. And there's some serious numbers being involved here, around 10 to 15,000 men. But they're very poorly armed. So effectively, what you have are armed civilians. Really, very few of these people have military experience. The vast bulk of them are armed with this pike, which is the kind of symbolic weapon of the 1798 rebellion. The town is held by Johnson, who's a veteran of the Revolutionary War. He only has about 2,000 guys, but they have a bit more training. And I won't go into big detail, but the battle goes on all day long. It is fought in the streets of the town. It is savage and brutal. There's an image you see here of United Irishmen running straight up into the mouth of an artillery piece, which obviously then discharges. But when we done our initial survey, and this is from just a kind of some of the key movements of that battle, the old town walls are shown on the map here, and the blue being the United Irishmen attack. It ends in a government victory. They eventually counterattack and take back the town, having lost the majority of it. But when we were doing our initial archaeological analysis, we highlighted a greenfield area and said, well, if anything is ever done there, they might find something. Okay. And if you see on this map where it says Cloney's failed attack on Irish Town, just on the right of the screen, is over a green area. And a number of years after we'd done that initial analysis that identified that as a kind of a high potential area, there was a sewage scheme that went through the town. So this is a rescue excavation. And an archaeologist called Vaughan Whitty did some phenomenal work on that. It was metal detected, and they found 16 objects that might have been related to 1798. And now these have big significance here because we haven't got many battlefields that have been investigated in Ireland. It's a bit different from the United States. Metal detection is actually illegal in Ireland. You need a license, and you generally need to be an archaeologist to do it. So we don't have a huge amount of information on the battlefields, but they are very well preserved as a result of that. So we're very fortunate. And as a result then, these finds allowed us to look at this engagement, and we were able to say that this material, you can see some of the bullets and sand shot fired from an artillery piece and below that were found in this from a very small sample. And what's particularly significant about this is that it gives us a piece of information that the history didn't leave us. There was an attack by a guy called, it looks like you should say it, called Clough. I learned this very quickly in Wexford. For some reason that's known only to Wexford people, you actually pronounce this guy's name as Coakley, right? But in any event, this guy Coakley had led a United Irishman assault in the morning that had not succeeded, and it was never known why it didn't. It never pushed forward into the town. It just seemed to retreat. And later in the afternoon, a guy called Thomas Cloney led another attack into the same area of the town, and it wasn't known. It was known there was heavy fighting there and that it failed, but it wasn't known that there was actually an artillery piece located there. They were attacking a group called the Clare Militia, but because one of the items we found from the archaeology was identified as coming as sand shot being fired from an artillery piece, it allowed us not only to put where the likely Clare Militia defensive line was on the day of the battle, but the fact that they'd sighted a gun in the middle of the road. And if you have a bunch of guys running down a road into the face of an artillery piece, it kind of removes much of the doubt as to why they might not have been pressing home their attack in the morning. So from this tiny piece of information, really, it's a really small piece of information. It's just showing you what it can tell us about the site. So yeah.
I mean, I just that's amazing that you can take written accounts of an event like that and then do battlefield archaeology on it and be able to confirm or give you a better understanding of those accounts that they wrote about. And it's also amazing to me to just think of what a 1798 battle would have looked like in the sense of with men mostly armed with pikes, being able to keep up an assault and stuff like that seems pretty amazing. Because I know in many Revolutionary War battles, they'll get into firefights where they'll be exchanging volleys and whatnot. But with the pike, I feel like you can only do so much as far as either repulse an assault or charge into them. So
yeah, and I mean, Ross is a good example of the pike being effective because they were able to repel a cavalry attack launched through those same fields actually, using the pike. But where its vulnerability, and in a lot of their early battles, they're effectively springing their engagements along confined roads and things like this, in a fashion that really suits the type of tactics they were using. But where it became exposed is when you come to somewhere like Vinegar Hill, when you have this mass of troops moving in from multiple directions who are significantly superiorly armed than you are. But what's remarkable about 1798 in particular is because of the limitations, say, of things like the pikes, they used the landscape. Things like the ditches and the field boundaries that are still sitting all over Wexford today are actually the key features in the battlefield. They're the equivalent of going, if you go to somewhere like Vinegar Hill, the equivalent of going to the Western Front and seeing a trench, because it is these ditches that are still being used today, largely still survive, are what they used to launch their attacks from, to seek shelter from fire. And we found that again and again and again and again, that they're the key elements of these battlefields. And it's something that we didn't really know beforehand, the extent to which that element has survived.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, you almost have to do, change your tactics to meet with whatever you have. Has anybody ever found a pike head in any of these archaeological sites?
On the sites themselves, they're quite rare. There's some, but there's significant numbers that it's difficult because they consistently made pike heads through the 19th century.
Sure.
Indeed, it's quite incredible to think this, but actually in 1916, some of the insurgents were armed with pikes in the initial phases of the attack on Dublin Castle. So it can be difficult to date them, but they are found. So there have been examples, for example, of the pikes found in the thatch, which is kind of a famous historical trope, that you would hide it in the thatch. And blacksmiths were being targeted around this period because, of course, it was blacksmiths who were making the pike heads. Very easy then to make them in a local scenario. So there are surviving 1798 pike heads, and there are bits and pieces of materials that have been taken off different battlefields that are now, say, in national collections, like occasional swords, muskets, things like that. So yeah. But not still there in an archaeological context today. We haven't found one of them yet, but our work is kind of only getting going on it.
Yeah, no, and I hope all the viewers and everybody who's listening to this. I think it's I think things like this show the importance of preserving archaeological sites until you can do a gridded dig, so you can actually get this information. Because sometimes when you find bullets or things like that randomly on a battlefield, that's great, but what information can you get from that? What story can you tell by having that information?
It's impossible to overstress that point, Mark. We'll see it now with Vinegar Hill. If the site have been not detected in the way that we did it, in terms of absolutely everything being down to the millimeter, the information that we got wouldn't be achievable. Even if we knew that stuff came from the field that they came in, the fact that we now know where we found material just allows us to tell an entirely different and more detailed story. It's vital that they are preserved.
Yes, absolutely. So tell us a little bit about Vinegar Hill.
Okay, so let's have a run through the archaeology of this then. So as I was saying, it's kind of the culmination of the campaign, and with these United Irishmen groups, you're not just dealing with the body of men themselves. There's an awful lot of civilians there, and there's thousands and thousands and thousands of them on Vinegar Hill. It's like a main United Irish encampment. So there are women and children up there. There are prisoners up there. And as I was mentioning, the government, as June wore on, and it suppressed the rebellion everywhere else, began to move in from different points of the compass to targeting Vinegar Hill, which is this high piece of ground just outside Enniscorthy. The early morning hours, they wheeled their artillery in, and they started about 4 a.m. to bombard the United Irish positions. And they do that for a number of hours to soften them up, right? So you imagine, again, you have a lot of people who aren't terrifically experienced militarily. You have a lot of what you would call classic civilians. There is all sorts of shell fire coming in on them for hours. And the columns, this is the Longest Day project, which was part of what we did. It was a group of archaeologists came together, working for Wexford County Council, with the resulting book that came out of it. But I'll just move to I think I've skipped a slide of it, but we'll come to it in a second anyway. The columns moved their artillery forward to an outer defensive line, and the first artillery begins to enfilade the United Irishmen's defensive position. So to enfilade, as I'm sure you know, but it's to fire. They managed to fire along the length of the United Irishmen's outer defensive line, and they fire anti-personnel rounds at them and kill somewhere between 50 and 60 of the United Irishmen in this area. And the United Irishmen defenses begin to collapse inwards. And at that point, they launch forward their columns. So a column had been coming through Enniscorthy town under Johnson, again, of New Ross fame, and fought through the town down towards the bridge and a river there, while other columns converged on the hill itself. And there's a desperate rearguard action fought by the United Irishmen on the top of this hill to hold open kind of one road that they can escape out of. And in a nutshell, they succeed in doing that after some very intense fighting. And most of the people on the hill manage to escape, but the back of the rebellion is broken, and there are colossal numbers of casualties up on the hill as well. But it could have been a lot worse. One of the government columns that was supposed to close that road under Needham, another Revolutionary War veteran, he didn't arrive in time. He actually got held up executing people further back the road. So it goes anyway. And he's always called the late General Needham after that, because he fails to close off that retreat route. But that's what breaks the back of the rebellion. But it becomes this massively iconic engagement as a result. So I think, sorry. So this map shows you, this is our original battlefield map from 2007. And the hill is on the right with the camp marked in hashers. And the blue line is the outer United Irishman defensive line. And you can see the red arrows are the assaulting columns that come forward, government columns. There's a hill marked on a green hill, and that's the approximate location where the artillery manages to enfilade the outer line. And over on the left, quite a long way away, you can see where Johnson has moved into the town. So, and fights his way down towards the river. So quite a large engagement. But when people go to Vinegar Hill, and you probably had this experience yourself, Mark, you kind of get captivated by the hill itself, and all your focus goes to the very crest of the hill, and people tend to think that is the battlefield. But when we were doing the analysis, we found, well, actually, the battlefield is an awful lot bigger than that. It moves out into the different areas. Just some of the images. This is an area where Johnson comes in over on the left of our map here, this little piece of high ground that you can see. And the bend in the road is where United Irishmen set up a small artillery piece to counter him. The hill is crowned by the ruins of a windmill, which was ruined in 1798, just as it's ruined today. And it's a real iconic structure. I'm sure you walked up to it when you were there, but it crowns this height on Vinegar Hill. So a surviving battlefield feature. But when you look all around there, all the ditches are massive, big earthen banks. They are ready-made fortifications. So the entire landscape you're looking at is a surviving landscape. This is the area of Green Hill. This is where the artillery enfiladed the outer line. So this, and you're looking at Vinegar Hill there, this is how big the landscape is. Unfortunately, this site has been lost to development quite recently. And you can see why they're picking locations like Vinegar Hill. This is the view from the top of it on a fine day. And they tended to do this during the rebellion. These kind of concentration points tended to be high points where you had views for miles in every direction. So it's an amazing locale. We had a number of different things we were trying to do, and I'll kind of go through these briefly so we can get to some of the finds. But identify, when we were doing the longest day project, identify the extent of the battlefield, where the fighting happened, what type of weaponry might be used, identify possible mass graves, and look to set standards for more research, because there hasn't been a huge amount of battlefield research done in Ireland. There's been some, but not a massive amount. As I said, it has to be licensed, these surveys. It's illegal to metal detect in Ireland without a license, and you have to be an archaeologist to get a license. And so we set out this really precise methodology of walking transects that were all flagged, 2.5 meter wide. We investigated everything that we were looking for lead bullets, effectively, to try and prove that the battlefield was there. GPS location of everything down to millimeter accuracy. And so it's a while ago now, we're actually just completing some of the final analysis. You can see how long it can take. But the first time we went down there, because of crops in fields, we had to split it in two. And we went down there in May 2017, and I was managing the field work, and we spent days there, and we targeted 3 fields that are marked here, and we found 1 bullet. I was a worried man coming off that site in May 2017. But we did find extensive evidence for the encampments. So evidence that people had been there in 1798, things like buckles and keys. And so we had been looking at this area, and we were marking all the fine spots here. And eventually we came back again in September, the phase 2 survey. This is near the crown of the hill. If you see on this left side image, kind of midway down the left-hand side, you can see the semicircular car park that's at the top of the hill that visitors to the site will go. They drive up a very narrow laneway that's between 2 of these fields here, which had been a concern because there was some suggestion, it was difficult for people to access the site, and this is a really kind of bad way of accessing the site and everything. But as we found, that laneway is absolutely key to events of the battle. These are the fields that we started detecting. You can see in the bottom right here, this long, slow slope up to the top of the hill. And then almost immediately when we started going in, we started finding bullets everywhere. Unbelievable spread. They just came up again and again and again and again. And because we were mapping, sorry, yeah, Mark, yeah?
I was just gonna say, you can tell like whether they've been fired or dropped, which helps you determine battle lines, correct?
Precisely. In many cases you can. So we saw one there just a moment ago that was very sheared and flattened. So it's fired probably at very close range, and it's hitting the upslope of the ground. So a lot of the balls were really, really highly impacted, which was suggestive of high impact at close range. And what we got when we mapped them all out is precisely this, is battle lines. You can see on the right-hand side image here, a cluster of black dots down the bottom here, which is showing a lot of the bullets. Unfortunately, the site just to the east of it, the green field to the east of us, was destroyed by development. But the prior to this, badly impacted at least. But what we have are lines of an advance, and it is the line of the Dundas Lake advance, which we had originally, if you see on the left-hand side, placed a bit farther to the north. But you can see there are 2 hills here. There's Vinegar Hill, and then there's another hill if you look at the height curves on the right-hand side of the map. What it turns out that the Lake Dundas force did was actually come up over the top of that hill and down through the saddle and up Vinegar Hill. And so they marched from right to left. And as you know from the revolution, it's very difficult to align men to fire, particularly when you're dealing, not all of these would have been massively highly trained. Some of them were militiamen, there were regulars there as well. But what we discovered from the archaeology was we detected on both sides of that laneway, but the intensive action is on the left side of this laneway that you access up. And what it is the government troops are advancing up towards the top of the hill, and they need something to align their flank on to keep in a straight line. And so they align themselves on that laneway that was there in 1798. So that the way you access that, the archaeology proved that that's a 1798 feature. And so all the action is happening on the other side of it. But we have bullets that are obviously dropped by nervous men who are trying to load cartridges in a line down at the bottom of this field as they move up to the advance. But so I mean, it's an incredible view actually, because you're looking, if you look at this image on the right, you can see the windmill just in the middle of the ditch. It is the highest point of Vinegar Hill. You can imagine a line of redcoats marching straight up this hill towards the United Irishmen. But we didn't just get bullets. So what we found in these fields as well is the United Irishmen doing this desperate rearguard action, attempting to hold off the government troops to try and keep open escape route. And so there's evidence of broken weaponry and things that kind of suggest hand-to-hand close combat. So parts of pistols were found, parts of muskets that had broken off were found. Really significantly, we got what we originally thought was case shot. It's actually sand shot. But again, they are wheeling artillery up behind their advancing line to fire anti-personnel artillery into the faces of the United Irishmen from almost point blank range. And this is hot off the press. These are actually the first time these finds have ever been shown. So this is a bit of a treat. But what we've been able to do here is actually, and it's the first time I'm aware of it happening in an Irish context, we can identify participants both on the United Irishmen and the government side. 2 buttons that you see on the right-hand side here are from a unit called the South Cork Militia. The South Cork Militia Regiment was not at Vinegar Hill. They did not fight at the Battle of Vinegar Hill as a unit, but one company did, the Light Company. The Light Companies from all the different militia units had been taken together and formed into a group of light companies. And so we know that the Redcoats attacking up here, at least some of them, are the light companies. But we also know that some of the United Irishmen who are fighting them are from South Wicklow, because one of the objects that was dropped was a halfpenny that came from a Wicklow mine. So these tokens that they would use in places like mines. A mine company, we can even say where it's from. Orla Scully, who did the analysis of this, and I should mention Michael Cahill and Jen Cahill, who did the military analysis as well. Orla Scully did the non-military finds analysis, and was able to find out that this token comes from the Cronbine miners mine in South Wicklow. This is incredible. Like to kind of, you're not far off of imagining faces here when you're thinking about where they're from. And so here we have an instance of Irish versus Irish. So huge amounts of new information on the battlefield, not only because, and all of that is because we had ID'd exactly where everything was. If we didn't know that, we wouldn't know where the lines were. We wouldn't be able to say that the artillery pieces, we can posit, for example, the probable locations of artillery pieces, which is what we're doing now in the analysis phase of it, to say where they were actually putting the artillery to fire at the United Irishmen. We wouldn't know that there were South Cork militia facing off against these Wicklow men. So yeah, that's I should note that a good friend of mine who passed away, F. Glenn Thompson, a while ago, who did this beautiful book, used some of the illustrations in it for here on the uniforms of 1798. But that's the type of information that we're getting out of it.
No, that's amazing. One of the things we love at Emerging Revolutionary War is, being in the spot where these battles took place. And nothing can confirm it to any truer sense than battlefield archaeology, like what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it completely, I know Vinegar Hill well, but it completely transforms your appreciation when you stand at the bottom of that slope and you look at that very specific field and a couple of fields to the left of it, and you know that quite a lot of people died in that exact spot. You know where people were standing. I mean, it's powerful stuff that, as you say, only really archaeology can give you.
Yeah, man. Like I said, I visited back in 2013, but yeah, after checking out this book and listening to you tonight, got to go back. So
yeah, it's well worth it. It's well worth the trip. Yeah,
have to go back, and definitely recommend. Yeah, if anybody in the future makes trips to go to Ireland or Europe, to definitely check out if you get a chance. Like I said, I went there in 2013, and it's a very cool site, and they got the museum down there in the town that gives you a good overview of the whole rebellion, but specifically Vinegar Hill and what happened there. But do you have any, if somebody wants to learn more about 1798 or learn more about this part of Irish history, anything else you would recommend they check out?
The book is certainly a very good start. There are a number of books written about 1798. There's books about Wexford in the war as well. There's too many for me to name now, but there's an awful lot of them. I mean, for all different levels of your interest in it, you can kind of trace it. One of the things that we're hoping will come out soon from our original Irish Battlefields project is, as I was mentioning it briefly earlier on, is going to be this volume. We're going to be doing a series of volumes, but hopefully it'll be in the next year or 18 months on 1798 battlefields, specifically looking at the battlefields. But yeah, it's well worth. And looking up some of the material on the web as well. So, for example, the website of the Knights and Rebels in Enniscorthy and looking at all that is highly recommended. But
yeah, what's Knights and Rebels? Is
that's because of Enniscorthy in the Enniscorthy Castle, and then the 1798 Rebellion Centre as well. So they both have different websites. But the Enniscorthy Castle is the Knights bit, and then the Rebels is 1798. So it's kind of the Enniscorthy package, if you like. Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot going on in Enniscorthy. It's a good town.
And also for any viewers who want to follow you, I saw on the things, if you want to just tell people how they want to follow your blog or any of the work.
Yeah. So if you're interested in the American Civil War, you can get us at IrishAmericanCivilWar.com. And there's YouTube channels. There's some of the conflict archaeology stuff is on there actually. There's one of the YouTube on the YouTube channel that you can link from Irish American Civil War. Actually, there's a talk that we gave during that second week of work. That's up there locally, so it was kind of as we were finding the material, so you can catch that there. Twitter at Irish ACW, generally wandering around American Civil War stuff with occasional archaeology. The other thing, for anyone who's interested in the later archaeology as well of our own kind of revolution, we also have a project called landscapesofrevolution.com. And there's a Facebook page for that, and that's kind of examines things like the Irish War of Independence and the archaeology that relates to that. So for anyone who can't get enough of revolutions,
Ireland certainly has plenty of them to.
It does.
Well, that's great. Yeah, Damian, thank you so much for taking the time this evening to talk with us. Folks who are interested more in the international legacy of the American Revolution, Emerging Revolutionary Wars, having a symposium this fall in September, last weekend in September in Alexandria, Virginia. We're gonna have speakers talking about not specifically Ireland, but other countries where there's an international influence of the American Revolution. And anybody who wants to also, we talk about being at the site of where the history happened. We got a bus tour coming up in November of Valley Forge and Monmouth. So get your tickets to come join us on that. That's going to be fun as well. But thank you, Damian. Appreciate your time coming here. And
no problem, Mark. Thanks.
We'll hope everybody had a good St. Patrick's Day week, and we'll catch you again in 2 weeks when we meet back here at 7 p.m. Thank you all for checking us out.